This podcast is brought to you by Blackaby Ministries International. To find out more, visit blackaby.org.
Well, welcome to the Richard Blackaby Leadership Podcast. My name is Sam, and I'm your host, and I'm joined by the man whose name is on the podcast.
The one and only.
The one and only, Richard Blackaby. So good to be with you again, Richard.
Oh, thanks.
We do this every once in a while. Mm-hmm. It's the leader profile.
Yeah.
And it's one of my favorite parts of this podcast because you get to kind of dive into history. You look at
pull out another biography,
so you're happy, so everybody's happy. So today, why don't you tell us who we're looking at?
Yeah, I this is always a fun time for me. I always go over to my biography shelf and decide what's the next one we'll look at.
It's like Christmas every time.
Oh, it's wonderful. It's glorious. I decided we'd look at J.P. Morgan today, who's one of our business leaders, and of course very famous, well-known. And the book I want to base it on is by Ron Chernow, called The House of Morgan. It's a great biography. And by the way,
you've had some others by Chernow.
Yeah, we have. We did Titan on Rockefeller.
That's right.
I'm actually reading his book right now on Hamilton, that the Broadway play is based upon. Chernow himself, I had someone tell me that recently heard him lecture, and he's kind of a stodgy, boring kind of lecturer. I mean, he reads from his manuscript, and you'd think, wow, to hear the guy speak is a little painful, but his writing style, I really enjoy his writing style. It's really well done. These are all substantial books. I think pushing 1,000 or so pages, but very thorough, and just has a lot of great little turns of phrases that keep it interesting. So there's certain biographers like Chernow that if you see one, it's like McCullough, who wrote Truman and a couple others like that when you see some of those guys, you just buy it. If there's another biography that he's done, I just get it. So all those are good. The Hamilton one I'm reading right now is very good. I really like the one on Rockefeller as well. I'd really recommend that also. But so this is on J.P. Morgan, and of course we're familiar with the Morgan Bank and Chase, our
J.P. Morgan Chase.
and the different Morgans. He is identified as in the Gilded Age after the Civil War period in American history. Sometimes called the robber barons.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking of.
These guys, whether it's Rockefeller or Vanderbilt, a bunch of these guys were building railroads right after the Civil War. Particularly, there was an explosion across the country. A lot of land being purchased. The stock market and the stock exchange all of a sudden is becoming very popular, and a lot of people are beginning to make money at a scale never imagined before. And Morgan is right there in the midst of it, and he's investing and becomes the most influential banker in American history. At one point, he 96 out of the top 100 companies in America banked with Morgan.
Wow.
When you got 96% of the top companies in the nation all banking with you, it was the thing to do. And
I think they'd call that a monopoly nowadays.
And that was monopolies were an issue back in the day because they became so prominent, and everybody wanted to bank with them. And also, just on a personal level, if you were going to invest your money, just your own personal assets, they decided not just to be open to the public at large, but they wanted to be very selective with who could even bank with them. You couldn't just walk in and say, I've just opened up my piggy bank and have $17. I want to start my savings account. They typically they didn't necessarily advertise this, but their kind of operating rule was, and you got to remember, this is back in the 1800s, 1890s, 1880s. And you had to have at least a minimum of $5 million in your personal account for them to open an account for you. So, so it was quite a prestigious thing. If you went to a party and you mentioned, I got run by the Morgan Bank to make a deposit, that was bragging.
Yeah, you were wealthy.
Everybody knew then you were well off. They said now and then they might stoop to let someone with only $2 million in their savings account bank with them just to do it as a favor.
Yeah.
We kind of bend our rules here. You only got $2 million in your checking account.
Wow.
We'll do you a favor. And so throughout this book, the Chernow writes, isn't just about J.P. Morgan. It looks at a series of people. George Peabody, actually, who's not a Morgan, starts the bank that the Morgans will take over. Junius Morgan is JP's father and tells his story, and then JP, and then it tells about his son Jack Morgan, and then follows on down the line just the history of the bank and some of the top leaders, the House of Morgan. So it's not just about JP, but takes you right up into modern times. And the influence of that bank and what it did. And he says that there's probably never going to be someone like J.P. Morgan or a bank like that again that can so dominate a country like the United States. But he had many, many successes that made him famous. They built their office at 23 Wall Street, right at the corner of Wall Street and Broad Street, and for years, it was just a relatively small building. It was not a high skyscraper or anything, but it was the center of financial power on Wall Street for many years. And when there are several notable moments, when Cornelius Vanderbilt died, he left his son William a bit over $100 million, making him the wealthiest man in the world. And at that time, though, it just baffled people. In the 1800s, to have $100 million, when if you had $100,000, you could be wealthy the rest of your life, never work another day. And this guy had $100 million, and he actually doubled that money in the next 6 to 8 years. But it scared people. Of course, in America, there was a great fear of kings and wealthy people dominating and basically destroying democracy. And so there was this innate fear of very wealthy, powerful people, which still gets played upon even in politics today.
For sure.
And so Vanderbilt ultimately felt that he needed to, instead of running this central railway where he had much of his wealth, he decided to sell off about 250,000 shares to the public so that the public could own it. And that's when the stock market and people all of a sudden thought, oh, I can own some of Vanderbilt's company. Well, Vanderbilt went to J.P. Morgan to sell the shares, and that kind of helped make his fame. And throughout history, Morgan...
So was that one of the first IPOs?
I don't know if it'd be one of the first, but certainly one of the biggest. And of course, that was an existing company that had been run for a while, but had been more of a privately held company.
Right.
And now he's going to open it up to the public. And he did several things. For instance, later when Andrew Carnegie decides to sell his steel company to make U.S. Steel, J.P. Morgan handled that purchase and ultimately offers Carnegie $480 million, making Carnegie one of the, or if not the wealthiest person at that time. Interestingly, after he signs the deal, sells his company for $480 million. Later, Carnegie's talking to Morgan and saying, I should have just asked for another $100 million when I sold that to you. And Morgan, not to spare the guy's feelings, said, well, I would have paid it if you'd asked for it. And so he realized, I could have had $100 million more. That probably irked Carnegie the rest of his life. But and there were a couple of times, for instance, in 1907, when there was a financial panic in America, and many, many companies were going bankrupt. People were committing suicide. And it was J.P. Morgan who actually came in and pulled people and resources together to stop the panic. And he did that again later in life, at least twice in American history, when there was a financial run and a crisis where even the U.S. government did not have the resources. It didn't have a Federal Reserve at that time. And they had to turn to a guy like Morgan to literally save the United States. from financial ruin. He had that kind of power that when everything was falling apart, you turned to him, and he could very powerfully and confidently stop the slide and stop the destruction. And so in times of crisis, people would look to a guy like him, but there were other times where people feared someone with that much power. Yeah. And there was always a suspicion. And part of what Morgan would do is that he would finance various companies. In the early days, it was primarily railroads, but he also invested in other kinds of factories and companies. And oftentimes he would insist then on being on the board of that company. And he would and so he had enormous influence, far beyond just the money that he had himself. Was all the control he had over so many other companies. And
if he's on the boards of,
and of course, then he would do whatever he could to help make those companies successful. And if it meant maybe crushing companies that he didn't invest in, and to develop monopolies and unfair trading advantages. And so he, throughout history, just developed some very, very powerful companies. The bank actually began in London. George Peabody was an American who moved to London and became the biggest American banker in England. And was trying to rival the Rothschilds and some of the biggest banks in Britain. And interestingly, when you look at some of these famous people, they're driven, they're smart, they're gifted, they're visionary, but oftentimes they're also lucky, and there's no way around it. You look back and say, well, why did he end up becoming so fabulously successful and this person over here didn't? It's not always because they had more brains. George Peabody was a bachelor his whole life, and Peabody's in fact, you could base the book Scrooge or Ebenezer Scrooge on Peabody. He, by the 1850s, he was earning around $300,000 every year, but he would spend about $3,000. So he's got, of course, 1850s, $300,000 a year.
That's a lot.
Goes
now.
a long way, yeah. And so he's earning $300,000 a year. One of the famous stories is that he was found but he didn't even take his own coach to drive around. He would take the bus or the public transport back then. And at one point he was seen waiting for the public transport to come, and someone said, well, I just saw one go by. He said, yeah, that was the 2-penny bus. I'm waiting for the carriage. I'm waiting for the 1-penny carriage. Here's a guy making $300,000 a year, and he doesn't want to spend literally an extra penny on his public transportation. And so he was a bachelor. He had no children. And so as he's getting older, he realizes, well, I've got to pass this company on to somebody. So he literally looks for an heir, looks for somebody that he can pass this very lucrative company onto. And ultimately, he's recommended to Junius Spencer Morgan. Junius is an American. He's brought over to London. He's basically told, if you'll work under me for 10 years, I'll let you take over this company. And so he works for him for 10 years. I mean, it's a great opportunity. And during that time, in 1857, the Crimean War comes to an end, and it led to a panic financially. And his bank almost goes bankrupt because of the financial downturn. And what that caused Morgan to do was to take a much more conservative approach. He said, he wanted to have control over. Back then, of course, there weren't real sophisticated management techniques and programs and training. And so a lot of companies were just not well run. And Morgan had a great eye to detail and to cautious investing and approach. And so he would want to be on the board to make sure things were run well. And it kind of led to the Morgan approach of saying, we'll invest in things that show high promise and are managed well, or we'll make them manage themselves well. And so Junius works under Peabody for 10 years and then ultimately is given the company. Peabody ends up not giving him nearly as much as he said he would. In fact, Peabody ended up saying, I don't want you to use even my name on the company. You got to change the name of the company. So he changes the name to Morgan. He didn't want to because nobody knew Morgan.
Yeah.
Everybody knew the name of Peabody, but kind of famously he changes that. And so Junius has a son, J.P. Morgan, and he decides ultimately to have J.P. run the American office. And so he puts him in New York City and says, I'll be based here in London, and you go to New York and try to, in that rough frontier country,
Yeah.
and you do the American investing there. And that's where JP ultimately, for about 33 years, he works under his father. And interestingly, his father's actually very concerned about him. He's restless, he's irresponsible, at times emotional. And so Junius will, for years, have his son JP work with a partner that's more older and experienced and calming. He kept trying to put a calming influence on his son. And it's interesting, one of the dynamics of the Morgans is that Junius only has one son, JP, and so he dotes on him and is very controlling of his son, writes him long, long letters, has his son come over every year for about 3 months to spend with him in London, and tries to mentor him, invest in him heavily. Then he'll go over to America for a month or two and spend it with his son. And so very controlling, very concerned about his son. That, it's interesting, these famous people like J.P. Morgan, and yet you read their father, who worried himself sick about his son, whether he'd make it or not. And and it's almost a domineering kind of thing, where when his father finally dies, J.P. Junius was sparing in his praise and affirmation. It's clear that he loved his son, but he was worried about him, and just that style, that Victorian kind of style of, you don't openly tell your son you're proud of him or he's doing a good job.
You don't do the whole feelings thing.
You tell him all the stuff you're worried about, and then J.P. Morgan kind of did the opposite with his son Jack. He also just had one son, Jack, and he loved his son as well, but he was just kind of too busy for him. And so,
which is the American way.
Yeah, he's doing the American way, and so they, in fact, Chernow says that perhaps the Morgan dynasty would have been different if they'd had more than one son. But all the pressure goes on that one son, and JP had all kinds of nervous issues. He was always stressed and burned out. He always talked about retiring, and the strain was too much. In fact, JP, even at an early age, would take 3-month vacations every year, which sounds pretty good for building the empire he had. He'd go on cruises and be gone for 3 months.
I feel like that's a good example.
Yeah, and I don't think that's going to show up in our policy manual anytime soon. But here's a guy that carried the burden all the time. He becomes fabulously successful in the financial world, and yet Chernow demonstrates over and over again how hard it was for him just to enjoy his success. He was always stressed, and they feel like a lot of that was the uber kind of responsibility that his father drilled into him.
Yeah.
And trying to please his father, trying to do a good job. And so they said Morgan was very successful, but he didn't really enjoy his success like you might have thought for a guy that was accomplishing the kinds of things that he did.
Well, let's take a quick break here, and we'll be right back.
Whether at home, on the job, or in the ministry, we can all have a greater impact on the world around us for the kingdom of God. Join Richard Blackaby at the Billy Graham Training Center at the Cove to learn about increasing your spiritual influence on April 6th through the 8th, 2020. Space is limited, so register soon at the link in the show notes. If you like what we're doing and would like to support our work, please consider making a donation. Even a little bit will go a long way toward keeping this podcast going for the months and years to come. To support this podcast, click on the link in the show notes. We are truly grateful for our wonderful community of listeners.
Well, Richard, I think our listeners probably know by now that with all of these leader profiles, there's usually a downside.
Yeah.
There's usually a dark side, a negative aspect of what led them to become the men and women that they were. And I suspect that J.P. Morgan is no different.
No.
Especially, it sounds like, with the family dynamics, as you already alluded to. So what were maybe some downsides of J.P. Morgan?
He has a number of them, and it's interesting. For one, like we've already touched on, his father was very domineering and put a lot of pressure. He would write him long, long letters advising him on how to live his life, and he was always worried that he was irresponsible and not in control of his emotions like he ought to be, and so was always trying to put older mentors around him and investing quite heavily in his son, but very much controlling, and so that caused all kinds of issues with JP. He was a nervous wreck, was depressed a lot, would have big bouts of depression, and he found one of the only ways to deal with it was to go sailing. He began buying very expensive, very large yachts that he would spend months at a time on. And another kind of interesting thing with Morgan was he was a fairly tall man, over 6 feet, but he was prematurely bald, and he had this what was called a bulbous nose. He had this enormous nose, and he had a skin condition that had affected his nose and some of his skin, and it basically they said his nose looked kind of like a cauliflower. It was very unattractive, very big, very noticeable. They said most of the time when you see a picture of Morgan in a book or something, it's been touched up. Most paintings of him and so on were always cleaned up.
The artist is a little generous.
Yeah, but there is one picture in the book of a kind of a candid shot where someone just took a photo of him, and it infuriated him because he didn't like people to see his nose as it was, and
wow.
And people would stare at him, and I mean, it was the kind of thing where if you just were looking at him, you couldn't help but notice. It was very hideous, and so he's always very self-conscious of that. And it's interesting because some of the most famous people, like John Rockefeller, had a particular kind of disease as well, which made him lose his hair early in life. And so he was famous for buying all these gaudy wigs all the time. He kind of got into wigs for a while, and people were never quite knew what John Rockefeller would look like when he showed up. And it's just one of those kind of, to me, in history, it's just kind of interesting, because you think of these guys that are literally saving the financial status of the nation of the United States with their power and influence. Morgan's the first guy in New York City to have electric lighting in his house, and yet he's very self-conscious about his nose. Or Rockefeller with his hair, and you realize these are people made of clay, just like everyone else, with their fears and their concerns. There's always tragedy in people's lives like this. He actually fell in love with a woman he'd known for 2 years when he was just a young man in his 20s still, named Mimi. And so he decides to marry her kind of spontaneously, doing something that his father would have been mortified about. But his fiance is already struggling with terminal tuberculosis, and so she's dying when he marries her. But he really loves her, and he literally had to carry her downstairs from her parents' home, carry her down the stairs for the wedding ceremony. Wow. And a lot of people, Chernow suggests that might be the only woman that he ever really loved, and he takes her on a honeymoon to the Mediterranean, hoping that the climate there will help her recover. But she dies 4 months after their wedding.
Wow.
While they're in France somewhere. And Chernow suggests that he never really loved another woman after that. And he kind of says that in one sense, it was a very noble thing for him to do. He's marrying this invalid out of love, and he's tenderly caring for her and doting on her and serving her, and Chernow says there were moments where the Morgans could be very sentimental, very noble, but oftentimes they kind of learned that you shut those off. You became the tough, intimidating banker kind of persona instead of the caring person doting over a woman dying of tuberculosis. So he ultimately marries a second wife that was named Fanny, and Chernow basically unpacks the fact that it was never a very loving marriage, and ultimately they became quite estranged. They, of course, never divorced, but later Morgan would have multiple affairs and mistresses, and they basically lived apart. He would travel and his escape was always his boat, and so oftentimes he wouldn't even go home. He would go spend the night on his yacht that was often parked just there in Manhattan. And they said it became his sort of man cave, his escape, where he could kind of do what he wanted to do. And he could bring girlfriends on the boat, or just friends that he could let his hair down and not just be the formidable banker that he was known for. But over and over again, Chernow says he was a very lonely man. And his partners often would be very intimidated by him. Even partners who'd been partners with him for years in the business would still call him Mr. Morgan. And he kept a certain aloofness, a gruffness. Once his father dies and leaves him about over $12 million. Chernow says it kind of took a restraint off of Morgan, and he began to purchase. He became a wild art collector. In fact, when he dies, he has one of the most expensive private art collections in America. It was valued at about $50 million when he dies, he begins to build bigger and bigger yachts and to spend more and more time away. They said when he was fighting depression, sailing at sea was one of the only times where he kind of got away from all the responsibility. And he was always talking about retiring, he just seemed like a lonely man. But also lucky as well. Like I said, he. Basically the Morgan Bank was handed to them by Peabody. That was just a stroke of good fortune. But throughout his life, he had several moments. For instance, in the Civil War, he paid $300 to have someone else go in his place. He would have been drafted to serve in the army, but back then you could actually pay someone to stand in for you. So he pays, and of course he could have easily died on a Civil War battlefield. But someone else goes instead, and he actually, his company helped fund the building of the Titanic. And when they built the Titanic, they actually built a beautiful stateroom for him because he financed it and was very influential with that company on the board. And so he had a beautifully decorated stateroom, and he had reservations to go on the maiden voyage of the Titanic. But business got in the way, and he had to pull out, even though he had probably the nicest cabin in the whole ship. And so he doesn't sail on that ship. And so he has those kind of moments in his life where he's very fortunate. He has moments where he makes some of the biggest deals with the Vanderbilts and with the Carnegies and folks like that. He establishes a chain of banks in Paris and London and New York City and Philadelphia and other parts of the country that where he has the wealthiest people in the country all wanting to bank with him, seek his advice. He would go and he became friends with the King of England. In fact, gave the King of England a $500,000 tapestry as a coronation gift. But at the end of the day, in fact, when he died, his net worth was kind of surprising. I mean, people were surprised. I think he was worth about $84 million for a guy who's swinging $500 million deals, who's regularly making $1 million commissions on deals. But he spent a lot of money on art, a lot of money on yachts, and it kind of surprised people, actually, that he wasn't worth a lot more. Some of the wealthy people, like the Carnegies, said they kind of felt sorry for him when they found out the most famous banker in the world didn't have more money than he had. But a tragic figure. And he left a son that was Jack, that was always insecure because he never knew if his father approved of him either. And a loveless marriage. And maybe the last thing to say, he had his youngest child was a daughter named Anne, who was very much like him and ultimately was estranged from him. And again, they said he could pull some of the biggest deals together. He could actually stop a depression in a financial run on Wall Street single-handedly, and yet he could not be reconciled with his youngest child. And again, just so much that you see in successful leaders in business and politics, very good perhaps in one area of their life, but huge blind spots in others and areas of weakness. Obviously, because you're good at making money doesn't mean you're good at saving money or good at relationships or marriages or child rearing. And I guess one of the big questions of history is, to be fabulously successful in one field, does it mean you have to neglect others? Do you have to go cheap on other areas of life so that you can be very successful in one area?
Is that the price of success?
And so it's an intriguing read about someone that continues to leave a mark and a legacy, but you realize very flawed and perhaps an unhappy person, successful in business, but never really finding the happiness that everybody seeks.
Well, it's an interesting read and a cautionary tale for us to look at, and so always enjoy walking through these halls of history with you.
There's more biographies to come.
Oh,
Sam.
I've seen the shelf, so it's not going to end anytime soon. Until next time.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. If this is something you enjoyed, it really makes a difference if you leave a review and a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. Don't forget to subscribe and share with your friends. We always love hearing from our listeners, so email us at podcast@blackaby.org.